My name is Maya. I am 32 years old. Last Saturday at my sister's engagement dinner, Andrea introduced me to the groom's family. She smiled at them the way she smiles at neighbours, warm, rehearsed, and said, "This is our other daughter. She is a gardener, always covered in dirt." Robert nodded. Didn't miss a beat. "We have given up on her." 45 guests, crystal glasses, and the groom's father, Jacob Sterling, a man I had met once before, 18 months ago, across a boardroom table, set down his fork, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered, "Wait, you are her." Andrea lost all colour. What happened in the next 40 minutes broke something in my family that I don't think will ever go back together. But I need you to hear how we got there, because the dinner was just the detonation. The fuse had been burning for 10 years. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I love reading those. The fuse was lit. Let me take you back 30 minutes before that exact moment. The air inside the Greenwich Country Club smelled like old money, roasted duck, and expensive lilies. Andrea had booked the VIP dining room. She had spent the last 3 months orchestrating every detail of this evening. It was Lauren's engagement dinner. But really, it was Andrea's coronation. She was finally marrying her golden child into the Sterling family. I sat at the very end of the long mahogany table. I wore a simple navy blue dress. No diamonds, no designer labels. I was placed strategically near the kitchen doors, far away from the centre of attention. Next to me sat Rosie. Rosie is 7 years old. She has big brown eyes, a gap-toothed smile, and she is entirely deaf. She is my adopted daughter and the absolute centre of my universe. But to Andrea, Rosie was a complication, a defect in her perfect family portrait. Before the guests arrived, Andrea had pulled me aside in the hallway. Her fingers dug into my arm. She told me to keep the child quiet. She told me not to use those weird hand gestures in front of the Sterlings. She meant sign language. She said it would make people uncomfortable. She wanted us to blend into the wallpaper, to be invisible. So, we sat in the shadows. I watched Andrea float around the room. She held a glass of champagne, laughing at jokes that were not funny, touching the arms of people she barely knew. She was playing the role of the sophisticated matriarch. Robert stood silently beside her. He held his drink, nodding exactly when he was supposed to, playing the successful bank manager. He never interrupted. He never offered an original thought. Lauren, of course, was the star. She sat near Jacob Sterling, flashing her 3-carat diamond ring under the chandelier. She talked about her upcoming trip to Europe, her wedding registry, her manicurist. She did not ask me a single question. Neither did Andrea. Neither did Robert. Under the heavy linen tablecloth, Rosie tapped my knee. Her small fingers moved quickly. She signed that she was hungry. I smiled down at her, making sure my hands were hidden from Andrea's line of sight. I signed back, telling her dinner was coming soon, promising her ice cream on the way home. Rosie beamed. I sat there, breathing in the scent of roasted duck and heavy perfume, feeling completely detached from the people sharing my DNA. I am the chief executive officer of a major ecological landscaping corporation. I manage hundreds of employees. I handle multi-million-dollar budgets. Yet, in that room, I was nothing more than the family embarrassment. the girl who played in the dirt. I watched Andrea lean in to speak to Jacob Sterling. She was preparing her grand introduction. She wanted to show him how gracious she was, even to her failures. She wanted to use me as a prop to elevate herself. She raised her glass, tapped it with a silver spoon, and called for everyone's attention. The room went quiet. The crystal glasses clinked. Andrea's voice echoed off the wood-panelled walls. She delivered her lines with practiced perfection. She praised Lauren's beauty. She praised Robert's hard work. Then she gestured loosely toward my end of the table, as if waving away a fly. She called me the gardener, the girl covered in dirt, the one they had given up on. A polite, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the guests. Lauren looked down at her napkin, hiding a small smirk. Robert stared at his wine. Andrea beamed, waiting for Jacob Sterling to offer a sympathetic smile. But Jacob did not smile. Jacob Sterling is a man who commands rooms. He built a luxury real estate empire from the ground up. He knows every detail of his business. He knows his people. He slowly lowered his silver fork onto his porcelain plate. The sound was sharp. It cut through the gentle hum of the room. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He ignored Andrea entirely. His eyes locked onto me, sitting quietly by the kitchen doors. "Wait," Jacob whispered. The whisper was loud enough to carry. "You are her." Andrea blinked. Her perfect rehearsed smile faltered. "Excuse me, Jacob," she asked, her voice high and thin. "Do you know Maya? She just does some yard work." Jacob stood up. He did not look at Andrea. He looked at me. "Maya," he said, his voice thick with absolute respect. "I did not know you were Lauren's sister. You never mentioned it." I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my voice steady, perfectly calm. "I like to keep my professional and personal lives separate, Mr. Sterling." The entire room froze. 45 people stopped breathing. Andrea's face lost all its colour. It drained away, leaving her looking like a hollow shell. She looked from Jacob to me, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "Jacob!" Robert finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "How do you know our Maya?" Jacob turned to Robert. His expression was cold. "Your Maya is the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Ecological. She is the lead contractor saving my new eco-resort development from a massive federal environmental fine." Jacob paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the white tablecloth. "She holds a $7.5 million contract with my firm. She is the smartest mind in commercial landscaping on the East Coast." Nobody moved. The silence was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly revealing. Andrea gripped the edge of the table. Her knuckles turned white. Her grand illusion, her carefully constructed narrative of the successful family with one pathetic, dirt-covered failure had just been detonated. And it was detonated by the very man she was trying to impress. Lauren stared at me, her mouth slightly ajar, the diamond ring forgotten. Robert looked like he had been struck by lightning. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at Andrea. I let her feel the full, crushing weight of reality. For 10 years, she had painted me as small. Now, the canvas was ripped to shreds. The truth was out. Andrea desperately tried to recover. She is a woman who survives on appearances, and her appearance had just been shattered into 1,000 pieces. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. "Oh, well," Andrea stammered, waving her hand erratically. "Maya is very private. She makes it sound so official. But really, it is just planting trees, isn't it?" "Sweetheart." She was begging me to play along. She was begging me to shrink back into the box she had built for me. She wanted me to nod, to lower my head, to protect her pride at the expense of my own dignity. I looked at her. I really looked at her. I saw the panic in her eyes, the desperate need to control the storyline. 10 years ago, I might have stayed quiet. 10 years ago, I might have let her win. But I was no longer that girl. I turned to Jacob Sterling. "It is much more than planting trees. As you well know, Jacob, our team will have the soil remediation reports on your desk by Tuesday morning." Jacob nodded firmly. "I look forward to it, Maya. Truly." I gently squeezed Rosie's shoulder. She looked up at me, her big brown eyes questioning. I signed to her, clear and visible above the table. I did not hide my hands. I signed time to go. Ice cream now. Rosie's face lit up. She slid out of her chair. I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my navy blue dress. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a tantrum. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single guest at that long mahogany table heard every syllable. "Andrea," I said. I did not call her Mom. "Robert." I did not call him Dad. "Thank you for the invitation, but I will not sit at a table where I am introduced as a punchline to people I do business with. Enjoy the rest of your evening." Lauren finally found her voice. "Maya, you cannot just leave. This is my night." "It is your night, Lauren," I replied smoothly. "And I am leaving so you can keep the spotlight." I picked up my small purse. I took Rosie's hand. Andrea stepped forward, blocking my path. Her face was flushed red with anger and humiliation. "If you walk out that door, you are embarrassing this family." Andrea hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You did that yourself." "Andrea," I whispered back. I stepped around her. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she is worth. I guided Rosie through the maze of silent guests, past the crystal glasses and the cold, roasted duck. The heavy, wooden double doors of the VIP room loomed ahead. I could feel 45 pairs of eyes burning into my back. I knew what they were thinking. The polished veneer was gone, replaced by raw, uncomfortable truth. I pushed the doors open. The cool air of the hallway hit my face. We walked away. I didn't look back. To understand the absolute silence in that dining room, you have to understand the noise of the last 10 years. You have to understand how a mother decides one child is gold and the other is just dirt. Growing up, the dividing line between Lauren and me was drawn thick and permanent. Andrea worshipped at the altar of appearances. She wanted a daughter who looked like a magazine cover, someone who would marry well and elevate her own social standing. Lauren was built for that role. She had perfect blonde hair, an easy laugh, and a talent for spending money. I was different. I liked the outdoors. I liked getting my hands in the soil. I was quiet, observant, and fiercely independent. Andrea hated that. She saw my independence as a rejection of her. The first clear example happened when I was 14. Lauren wanted a designer prom dress. It cost $800. Andrea bought it without blinking. That same week, I asked for $40 to join the school biology field trip. Andrea sighed, rolled her eyes, and told me money was tight. She said I needed to learn the value of $1. So, I got a job pulling weeds for the neighbors. I paid for the trip myself. That was the day I realized I was entirely on my own. The second example was the living room wall. Andrea called it the Wall of Pride. It was covered in heavy, ornate wooden frames. There were photos of Lauren's ballet recitals, Lauren's cheerleading trophies, Lauren's college acceptance letter. There was even a framed napkin from a fancy restaurant Lauren visited in Paris. My section of the wall, it did not exist. There was not a single photograph of me. When I graduated high school with top honours in science, the diploma sat on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks before Robert finally filed it away in a drawer. Out of sight, out of mind. The third example was the way they spoke about our futures. Robert would sit in his leather armchair, swirling his scotch, talking about Lauren's potential. He would say she was destined for high society. When the topic turned to me, the tone shifted. It became a heavy, burdened sigh. Andrea would look at me, covered in mud from my weekend landscaping jobs, and shake her head. Maya just does not have the refinement, she would say to her friends on the phone, making sure I could hear. She likes the dirt. We just pray she finds a nice, blue-collar boy to settle down with. We do not expect much. Robert never corrected her. His silence was the loudest agreement in the house. He was a middle management bank employee who lived in fear of his wife's temper. He chose peace over his eldest daughter. They did not see my ambition. They did not see the complex ecological systems I was studying in my bedroom late at night. They only saw the dirt under my fingernails. They built a narrative where Lauren was the star, and I was the embarrassing extra. I let them believe it. In a house filled with cold shoulders and constant criticism, I had exactly one safe harbour. His name was Walter. He was Andrea's father. But they could not have been more different. If Andrea was obsessed with polished marble and crystal, Walter was a man of oak and rich, dark soil. Walter was my grandfather, and he was my only true ally. He lived in a small, weathered farmhouse on the edge of town, while Andrea was dragging Lauren to country clubs. I was spending my weekends at Walter's place. He taught me how to listen to the earth. He showed me how to test soil acidity with my bare hands, how to graft saplings, and how to revive a dying oak tree just by altering the water flow around its roots. People lie, Maya. Walter used to tell me, wiping sweat from his deeply lined forehead. Roots do not. You give them what they need, and they grow strong. You poison the ground, and they rot. Remember that. He saw Andrea for who she was. He saw Robert's cowardice. He never explicitly criticized them to me, but he made sure I knew my worth did not depend on their validation. He made sure I felt seen. When I was 21, Walter got sick. His heart, which had been so large and generous, finally started to give out. I spent every night at the hospital, reading him books about native plant restoration. Andrea rarely visited. She said hospitals depressed her. On his last night, Walter asked the nurses to leave us alone. He was frail, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were sharp. He reached into the drawer of his bedside table and pulled out an old, battered wooden cigar box. He placed it in my hands. It felt heavy. "Open it," he whispered, his voice raspy. Inside the box were 2 things. The first was the key to his old, reliable chainsaw. The second was a stack of crisp $100 bills. $1,500 in total. That is your seed money, Maya. Walter said, coughing weakly. "Do not tell your mother. Do not tell your father. You take this and you plant your own forest." I cried. I held his rough, calloused hand and promised I would. Before he closed his eyes for the last time, he pulled me close. He smelled of sterile hospital sheets, but underneath that, the faint, comforting scent of pine needles lingered. "There is something else," he murmured, his breath brushing my ear. "A safety net, deep roots. When the storm comes, and it will come, you look for the paperwork. Promise me you will not let her break you." I did not understand what he meant by the paperwork at the time. I was too consumed by grief to ask questions. I just nodded, clutching the cigar box to my chest. He passed away the next morning. Andrea cried loudly at the funeral. I stood quietly in the back, holding the key to a chainsaw in my pocket. Walter gave me the tools to build my life. I kept the secret safe. The summer I turned 18, the final, unmistakable line was drawn. It happened on a Tuesday evening in late August. The air conditioning in the house was humming loudly, fighting against the thick humidity outside. I was sitting at the kitchen island, mapping out my community college courses. I had received a partial scholarship, but I still needed help with the remaining tuition and textbooks. I had assumed, naively, that the college fund Andrea and Robert had set up when I was a baby would cover the rest. Andrea walked into the kitchen, carrying a sleek, leather-bound folder. She did not ask about my classes. She did not offer a cup of tea or a word of encouragement. She dropped the folder onto the granite countertop right over my course catalogue. Lauren was turning 16 that week. She had been begging for a brand new, cherry red convertible. I knew they were expensive. I did not know they were expensive enough to cost my entire future. Andrea opened the folder. Inside was a legal document, printed on heavy white paper. The title at the top read, "Severance of Support." "We need you to sign this. Maya," Andrea said. Her voice was perfectly smooth, completely devoid of guilt. "Your father and I have decided that it is time for you to learn true independence. We are reallocating the family education funds to better suit Lauren's immediate transportation needs." I stared at the black ink on the white page. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was brutally simple. By signing it, I was legally acknowledging that Andrea and Robert were no longer financially responsible for me in any capacity. I was agreeing to forfeit any claim to the college savings account they had maintained in my name. I was agreeing to leave the house by the end of the month. I looked up. Robert was standing by the sink. He had his hands in his pockets. He was staring intensely out the window at the neighbour's sprinkler system, refusing to make eye contact with me. He was letting her do it. "You are using my tuition money to buy Lauren a car," I stated flatly. It was not a question. Lauren has a certain image to maintain for her social circle. Andrea replied, adjusting her pearl necklace. "You have always been so resourceful. Maya, you like getting your hands dirty. You will figure it out. Now, sign the paper." There was no argument. There was no screaming match. I realized in that precise second that I was not a daughter to them. I was a budgetary inconvenience. I picked up the heavy black pen lying next to the folder. My hand did not shake. I signed my full name on the dotted line. I flipped to the second page. Where my copy was attached, I tore it off, folded it neatly into thirds, and slid it into my cheap canvas wallet. I went upstairs, packed my clothes into 2 duffel bags, and walked out the front door. It had started to rain, a heavy, relentless summer downpour. I climbed into the rusted, used truck I had bought with my own landscaping money. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. I kept that paper safe. People always ask the same question when they hear about that night. They ask it with genuine confusion, their brows furrowed in disbelief. Why did you stay in contact if they threw you out in the rain at 18? Why would you ever pick up the phone when they called? Why on earth would you show up to a fancy engagement dinner 10 years later just to sit in the corner? The answer is not simple. It is a psychological trap, a heavy, invisible chain designed specifically for the family scapegoat. Psychologists have a term for it. They call it learned helplessness. When you are conditioned from a very young age to believe that your worth is tied entirely to how well you serve someone else's ego, your brain fundamentally changes. You are trained to absorb the blows. You are programmed to believe that the coldness, the neglect, and the cruelty are somehow your own fault. For years, a quiet, desperate voice echoed in the back of my mind. It whispered a dangerous lie. It told me that if I just worked a little harder, if I became a little more successful, if I never caused a scene, maybe Andrea would finally look at me the way she looked at Lauren. Maybe Robert would finally stand up and defend me. It is the illusion of hope. That illusion is the most toxic poison a child can ingest. Every time I achieved something on my own, I would inevitably get a phone call from Andrea. She would never congratulate me directly. She would call to complain about a neighbour or to brag about Lauren's latest shopping trip. And then she would drop a subtle, backhanded compliment about my work. She would throw a tiny breadcrumb of attention onto the floor, and my starved inner child would instinctively reach for it. They train you to survive on those breadcrumbs. They condition you to accept the absolute bare minimum of human decency and mistake it for love. You become so accustomed to the emotional freezing temperatures that you forget what warmth actually feels like. When Andrea called to invite me to the engagement dinner, she used her soft, motherly voice, the one she reserves for public spaces and manipulation. She said the family would not be complete without me. She said Lauren really wanted me there. I knew it was a performance. I knew she just wanted to present a flawless, united front to the wealthy Sterling family. But that old, rusted chain pulled tight around my chest. The obligation of blood. The deeply ingrained fear of being the one who officially breaks the family apart. So, I bought a new dress. I brushed Rosie's hair. I drove to Greenwich. I walked into that VIP dining room, hoping, against all logic and past evidence, that just for one night, I could simply be a sister and a daughter. I had to sit through that dinner. I had to hear Andrea call me a dirty gardener in front of Jacob Sterling. I had to feel the absolute, undeniable sting of public humiliation one final time. I needed that public execution to permanently shatter the illusion of hope. The chain finally snapped. The morning after I left Andrea's house in the rain, I drove my sputtering truck to the hardware store. I took the cigar box Walter had given me, the one smelling faintly of pine needles and old tobacco. I counted the crisp $100 bills. $1,500. It was all I had in the world. I did not spend it on rent right away. I slept in the cab of my truck for 3 weeks. I used the money to buy professional-grade pruning shears, heavy-duty rakes, a reliable soil testing kit, and a large tank of gas. I printed cheap flyers at the local library. I knocked on doors in neighbourhoods far away from Andrea's country club. I started small. I cleared overgrown lots. I hauled away dead branches. I worked from the moment the sun broke over the horizon until it was too dark to see my own hands. My palms blistered, then bled, and eventually turned into thick, unyielding calluses. My shoulders ached with a deep, persistent throb that never really faded, even when I slept. But I was free. Every drop of sweat belonged to me. By the end of the first year, I had saved enough to rent a tiny, drafty apartment. I started taking night classes online, studying advanced botany, soil chemistry, and ecological restoration. I learned how to heal damaged earth. I learned how to design landscapes that cleaned water runoff and supported local wildlife. I realized quickly that pulling weeds for homeowners would only pay the bills. If I wanted to build an empire, I had to solve massive problems for massive corporations. I officially registered Apex Ecological in my third year. I stopped calling myself a landscaper and started operating as an environmental architect. I hired my first employee, a brilliant but overlooked botanist named Eleanor. Then I hired a crew of 5 hard-working men who had been laid off from a local nursery. We took the jobs no one else wanted. We rehabilitated a toxic industrial park on the edge of the city, turning it into a thriving green space that won a regional urban design award. The award brought media attention. The media attention brought commercial developers. I poured every ounce of my energy into the company. I negotiated contracts in muddy work boots and safety vests. I learned to read complex legal zoning codes better than most municipal lawyers. I built a reputation for being uncompromising, scientifically rigorous, and absolutely relentless. Apex Ecological grew from a rusted truck into a fleet of 20 vehicles. We moved into a sleek, glass-walled office building downtown. My staff expanded to over 200 landscape architects, field technicians, and environmental scientists. We were no longer just planting trees. We were reshaping the commercial geography of the entire state. Andrea and Robert never knew any of this. Whenever Andrea called, she only asked if I was still playing in the dirt. I always answered yes. I let her keep her comfortable, condescending narrative. I did not need her validation anymore. I was too busy building something permanent. I built my own forest. As Apex Ecological expanded, my bank accounts swelled and my professional influence grew. But when I drove home at night, the silence inside my modern, glass-walled apartment was incredibly loud. I had built a thriving ecosystem for my business, but my personal life was a barren landscape. I had deliberately isolated myself, terrified of letting anyone close enough to hurt me the way Andrea and Robert had. That changed during a pro bono project in my 5th year of business. My company had volunteered to redesign the grounds of a state-run children's home on the outskirts of the city. The old yard was nothing but cracked concrete and dead grass. We were turning it into a sensory garden filled with soft mosses, fragrant herbs, and running water features. I was kneeling in the dirt on a Tuesday afternoon, planting a row of lavender, when I felt a small tap on my shoulder. I turned around and saw a little girl. She was tiny, maybe 4 years old, wearing a faded yellow dress. She had big brown eyes that watched me with intense, quiet curiosity. She pointed at the lavender plant, then pointed to the dirt. "Do you want to help?" I asked, offering her a small trowel. She did not answer. A caretaker hurried over, looking apologetic. She explained that the little girl's name was Rosie. She had been in the system for 2 years, and she was completely deaf. I looked back at Rosie. She was still staring at the lavender. I put the trowel down. I patted the earth next to me, inviting her to sit. She hesitated for a moment. then dropped to her knees. I took her small hands, placing them over mine. Together, we pressed the roots of the lavender into the dark, rich soil. We patted the dirt firmly around the base. Rosie looked at our hands. They were both covered in dark, heavy mud. She looked up at my face, and for the first time, she smiled. It was a wide, gap-toothed, brilliant smile. In that exact moment, a profound shift happened inside my chest. I felt a root take hold. I started visiting the children's home every weekend. I began taking intensive sign language classes every evening after work. I learned how to say hello, tree, water, and, eventually, I love you. Rosie and I communicated in the quiet space between gestures, finding a deep, unspoken understanding. We were both outsiders. We both knew what it felt like to be overlooked. The adoption process was rigorous, bureaucratic, and exhausting. It took 18 months of background checks, home visits, and endless paperwork. But I fought through it with the same relentless energy I used to build my company. The day the judge finally signed the final adoption decree, I held Rosie in my arms in the courthouse hallway. I realized then that Walter had been entirely right. You get to choose what you nurture. Family is not a biological obligation. Family is the person who sits in the dirt with you and helps you grow. She became my whole world. 18 months before Lauren's disastrous engagement dinner, Apex Ecological faced the ultimate test. My firm had been invited to pitch for the largest contract in our history. The Sterling Corporation, a titan in luxury real estate, was developing a sprawling billion-dollar eco-resort along a highly sensitive coastal ridge. They had a massive problem. Their previous contractors had severely mismanaged the site's drainage, pushing the corporation toward a devastating federal environmental fine and a complete halt of construction. They needed a miracle. They needed someone to fix the unfixable. I walked into the Sterling Corporation headquarters on a rainy Tuesday morning. I wore a sharp, tailored navy blue suit. I carried a single, thick leather binder containing 3 months of exhaustive ecological analysis, predictive soil models, and a legally airtight remediation strategy. The boardroom was intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. 12 executives sat around a massive oak table, looking stressed and impatient. At the head of the table sat Jacob Sterling. He radiated quiet, absolute authority. He did not suffer fools, and he clearly did not have time for empty promises. "Miss Holloway," Jacob said, his voice a low rumble, "you have exactly 20 minutes to tell me why your firm can save this project when 3 international conglomerates have already failed." I did not flinch. I did not soften my voice. I opened my binder. I walked them through the catastrophic errors in their current soil retention plan. I cited federal wetland protection statutes from memory. I laid out a completely redesigned topographical map that not only bypassed the federal fines, but actually created a natural water filtration system that would save the resort millions in long-term utility costs. I spoke for precisely 19 minutes. When I finished, the room was completely silent. The executives looked at my charts, then looked at Jacob. Jacob stared at me, his sharp eyes evaluating every word I had just spoken. He closed the file in front of him. He leaned back in his leather chair. "Your retention rate for your field technicians is 92%. Jacob noted, bringing up a detail buried deep in the corporate appendix. "Why is that?" Because I pay them above industry standard. Mr. Sterling, I answered smoothly. And because I never ask my crew to stand in mud that I haven't personally tested myself. Loyalty builds better foundations than fear. Jacob Sterling's face shifted. The hard lines around his mouth softened into a look of genuine, profound respect. He recognized a builder when he saw one. I have signed a lot of checks in my life, Maya, Jacob said slowly. This is the first time I feel entirely confident in a $7.5 million signature. We shook hands across the heavy oak table. He treated me as an equal. He treated me as an expert. It was the exact opposite of how Andrea had treated me my entire life. I walked out of that skyscraper with the contract that solidified my empire. I earned every single penny. The hum of my car engine was the only sound as we drove away from the Greenwich Country Club. The rain had started to fall, slicking the dark suburban roads. In the rearview mirror, I could see Rosie fast asleep in her booster seat. Her small head rested against the plush velvet pillow, completely oblivious to the emotional explosion I had just left behind in the VIP dining room. My heart was beating a steady, rhythmic pulse. I expected to feel guilt. I expected to feel the old, familiar panic of disappointing Andrea, the heavy dread that used to swallow me whole whenever I stepped out of line. But as I navigated the winding roads back toward the city, I felt absolutely nothing but clear, sharp oxygen filling my lungs. I pulled my car into the private underground garage of my downtown building. I unbuckled Rosie, lifting her warm, sleeping weight against my shoulder, and carried her into the private elevator. The doors opened directly into my penthouse. I had bought it in cash 2 years ago. The space was wide, open, and anchored by massive walls of glass overlooking the city lights. The air smelled of cedarwood and eucalyptus, a custom essential oil blend that always grounded me. I carried Rosie down the hall, laid her gently under her heavy quilt, and turned on her small nightlight. I stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching her chest rise and fall. She was safe. She was protected. She would never, ever know the feeling of being discarded by the people who were supposed to shelter her. I walked into my master bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead vanity lights. I looked at my reflection in the wide mirror. I saw the navy blue dress. I saw the faint, permanent calluses on my hands resting on the marble counter. I saw a 32-year-old chief executive officer. I saw the woman Jacob Sterling respected. I no longer saw the dirty, embarrassing gardener Andrea desperately needed me to be. The ghost of the scapegoat was finally gone. I walked out to the kitchen island and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. Before I could take a sip, my phone, resting on the granite counter, began to vibrate. The screen lit up in the dark kitchen. The caller ID flashed Andrea's name. It buzzed relentlessly, vibrating across the stone surface like an angry insect. I let it ring. It stopped. A second later, it started buzzing again. Then again. 3 missed calls, 5 missed calls. Then, the text messages started flooding the lock screen. Rapid-fire notifications, lighting up the room. They were not apologies. I knew exactly what they were. They were the desperate, scrambling attempts of a manipulator losing her grip on the narrative. I picked up the phone. I did not turn it off. I just stared at the glowing screen, watching Andrea's panic manifest in real time. She thought she could still pull the strings. She thought I would eventually fold. The war had just begun. The voicemail indicator blinked a steady, rhythmic red. 8 new messages. I poured my water and pressed play on the speakerphone. Andrea's voice filled the quiet kitchen. She did not sound apologetic. She sounded deeply inconvenienced, as if my success was a personal attack on her schedule. "Maya, you completely humiliated me," she began, her tone sharp and clipped. "You made a scene in front of the Sterlings over a simple misunderstanding. Call me back immediately. We need to fix this before you ruin your sister's future." The second message arrived 10 minutes later. It was softer, employing her classic victim pitch. She stretched her vowels, forcing a tremor into her throat. "I am your mother, Maya. You cannot just walk out on your sister's big night to show off. We have always tried our best with you." I deleted them one by one. The audacity of her revisionist history was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite a public execution into a minor family squabble. Robert sent a single text message at 2 in the morning. It contained exactly 7 words. "You need to apologize to your mother." I stared at the glowing letters on the screen. The absolute cowardice of that man never failed to astonish me. He had stood silently by while Andrea stripped away my dignity, my college fund, and my place in the family. Now, he wanted me to apologize for surviving it. I did not type a response. I placed the phone face down on the cold granite. I walked over to the glass wall and looked out over the sleeping city. Down below, millions of people were living their lives, entirely unaware of the petty, toxic dramas playing out in living rooms across the state. I realized I was finally one of them. I was completely removed from the hollow shell of Andrea's influence. Let them spin in the dark. The next morning, the confrontation came directly to my doorstep. I was reviewing topographical maps in my corner office at Apex Ecological when my assistant buzzed. Andrea was in the lobby, demanding entry. I did not panic. I simply told security to send her up. She walked into my office wearing a beige silk trench coat, looking wildly out of place among the drafting tables, the soil samples, and the large terrariums. She did not admire the space. She did not sit down in the leather guest chair. She opened her designer bag, pulled out a thick stack of municipal zoning documents, and dropped them onto my desk. "Lauren's new house," Andrea demanded, pointing a manicured finger at the papers. "The Sterlings bought that beautiful plot on the Eastern Ridge for the newlyweds, but the city just put a hold on the construction. They say it is a protected wetland. They say Apex Ecological holds the environmental veto power for that specific commercial district." I looked at the coordinates printed on the top page. I knew that ridge intimately. It was a vital, highly sensitive drainage basin that my firm had spent 3 years lobbying to protect. "We need your signature to bypass the restriction," she insisted, her voice tight with entitlement. She was not asking for a favor. She was ordering compliance. "Jacob Sterling expects this handled quietly. You owe us this." Maya. She had come to collect what she believed she owned. She still thought of me as the 14-year-old girl desperate for $40. She assumed my multi-million-dollar company was just another asset she could manipulate for Lauren's benefit. I folded my hands over the topographical map. "I cannot sign that, Andrea," I said evenly. "That ridge prevents flooding for 3 lower-income neighborhoods downstream. Building a 50,000 square foot mansion there violates federal environmental statutes." Her beige silk coat rustled sharply as she crossed her arms. "Do not give me that tree-hugging nonsense. Maya, this is your sister's future. The Sterlings are furious about the delay. You owe us your cooperation." I stood up. I was taller than her. and for the first time, I let her feel the height difference. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied, my voice dropping to a calm, absolute zero. "You forfeited any right to make demands of me the night you forced me to sign away my education. The answer is no. My firm will not approve the permit under any circumstances." Andrea's face contorted into something ugly and raw. The mask of the sophisticated matriarch slipped off completely. She cursed at me, her voice shrill, echoing through the thick glass walls of my office. She threatened to ruin my reputation, to tell the Sterlings I was a vindictive liar. I did not raise my voice. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. I asked security to politely escort my mother out of the building. The boundary was officially drawn in concrete. If you have ever had to set a hard boundary with someone who thought they owned you, tell me in the comments. We are in this together. After security escorted her out, the silence in my office felt different. My hands trembled, just slightly. For the first time in years, I needed grounding. I needed the earth. I took the elevator down to the small, climate-controlled archive room in the basement of my building, where I kept Walter's old personal belongings. I opened the heavy wooden cigar box. I traced the worn edges of the cedar, inhaling the faint scent of pine needles. Underneath the faded velvet lining at the bottom, my fingers caught on something cold and metallic. It was a heavy brass key with a sequence of numbers stamped into the side. A bank vault key. Walter's last words echoed in my mind. A safety net. Deep roots. Look for the paperwork. I drove to the downtown financial district immediately. Inside the dusty, quiet vault room of the oldest bank in the city. The manager helped me locate the corresponding box. I turned the brass key. The metal drawer slid out smoothly. Inside was a thick, heavy manila envelope. I broke the seal right there in the small viewing room. The first document was an irrevocable trust, established by Walter when I was 10 years old. He had placed the original deed to his farmhouse and the 50 surrounding acres of prime agricultural land directly into my name. He had completely bypassed Andrea, legally locking her out of the inheritance. But it was the second stack of papers that made my blood run entirely cold. It was 2 decades of bank statements. Walter had meticulously tracked the college fund he had set up for me when I was born. Every deposit he made, every withdrawal. Highlighted in bright yellow ink were dozens of transfers authorized by Andrea Holloway. $5,000 withdrawn a week before Lauren's extravagant 16th birthday party. $10,000 transferred to a luxury travel agency right before Andrea and Robert took a month-long European vacation. By the time I turned 18 and needed the money for community college, the account was entirely drained. She had not reallocated my funds to buy Lauren a car because money was tight. She had been stealing my future for years to fund her own lifestyle. The paperwork held the absolute truth. This is the ultimate, undeniable power of documentation. When you deal with highly toxic individuals, they thrive in the grey areas of human memory. They gaslight you. They cry on command. They twist conversations, selectively forget their own cruelty, and rewrite history until you begin to doubt your own sanity. They use emotion as a weapon to disorient you. But ink printed on official bank letterhead does not cry. An irrevocable trust does not change its story when the audience shifts. Paperwork is cold, absolute, and entirely immune to emotional blackmail. Looking at those bank statements, I realized Andrea's greatest weapon had always been my own silence and my willingness to absorb her blame. She operated under the assumption that family secrets stay buried because exposing them is too painful. She counted on my shame to protect her crimes. But I was holding the antidote to her poison. The math was flawless. The dates aligned perfectly with Lauren's milestones and Andrea's vacations. There was no room for interpretation, no space for her to weave a new, sympathetic narrative. I gathered the documents carefully, sliding them back into the manila envelope. I did not feel a sudden rush of sadness. I felt a terrifying, crystalline clarity. For 10 years, I had believed I was the unwanted burden, the child who was not worth the investment. The truth was, I was the bank rolling their illusions. I held the undeniable proof of her theft in my calloused hands. I did not call Andrea to scream. I did not send an angry, emotional text message. I left the bank and drove straight back to my office. I called my lead corporate attorney, Grace. Grace is a woman who speaks softly, wears impeccable grey suits, and carries a very heavy legal hammer. We sat in my office until midnight. We did not write a lengthy legal rebuttal to Andrea's demands. We compiled every highlighted bank statement, the official deed from the irrevocable trust, and a notarized copy of the severance of support document Andrea had forced me to sign 14 years ago. We placed these documents into 5 identical, high-quality navy blue binders. The Apex Ecological logo was subtly embossed on the front cover, excellence in every detail. Grace looked at the mountain of evidence and asked if I wanted to file criminal embezzlement charges immediately. I shook my head, running my hand over the smooth cover of the top binder. No, I said quietly, looking out at the city lights reflecting in the glass. We are going to conduct a family audit. I wanted her to face the exact same audience she had used to humiliate me. I wanted the execution to be public, undeniable, and perfectly documented. If you are ready to see how cold, hard facts dismantle toxic lies, hit that like button. The storm is here. 2 days later, Andrea took the bait. She summoned a family meeting, claiming it was an absolute emergency regarding the wedding preparations. She chose the private library of the Greenwich Country Club, aiming for maximum intimidation and social pressure. She had specifically invited Jacob Sterling and his wife, attempting to force my hand in front of the people I respected most. I arrived 5 minutes early. I wore the exact same simple navy blue dress I had worn to the engagement dinner. I carried a heavy canvas tote bag containing the 5 binders. Andrea sat in a velvet wing-back chair, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Robert stood rigidly behind her, looking everywhere but at me. Lauren looked pale and incredibly nervous, twisting her diamond ring. Jacob Sterling watched me enter. His posture was straight, his expression completely unreadable. He was a man waiting for the facts. Maya is trying to ruin your son's wedding. Jacob! Andrea sobbed as soon as I sat down. The performance was Oscar-worthy. She is refusing to sign the land permits for their new home out of pure, bitter jealousy. We have tried everything to love her. We supported her when she had nothing. And this is how she repays her family. The trap was fully set. I did not interrupt her performance. I waited until Andrea paused for breath, letting the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. The room was heavy with the smell of old leather, polished wood, and Andrea's expensive perfume. I reached into my canvas bag. I pulled out the navy blue binders. I slid one across the table to Jacob. I slid one to Lauren. I slid the thickest one directly to Andrea. I am not here to discuss ecological building permits, I stated. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, operating at the frequency of a corporate board meeting. I am here to discuss the missing $85,000. Andrea froze. The lace handkerchief dropped to her lap. I opened my binder to the first tab. Page 4, I instructed the room. A $10,000 withdrawal signed by Andrea Holloway. 2 weeks later, a matching receipt from a Parisian luxury boutique. I turned the page slowly. Page 12, $7,000 transferred out of my educational fund. The exact week Lauren received her new convertible. The air in the library stopped moving. The only sound was the heavy, crisp turning of thick paper. Lauren stared at the highlighted bank statements. Her perfectly manicured fingers hovered over the numbers, trembling slightly. Her eyes darted from the pages to Andrea's face, then back to the undeniable proof. The reality was crashing down on her in real time. Her entire life of luxury, her designer clothes, her elite education, had been funded by the systematic theft of my future. "Mom," Lauren whispered, her voice cracking, stripping away years of practiced arrogance. "Is this true? Did you take her college money to buy my car?" Andrea's face turned an ugly, mottled red. The sophisticated facade completely melted away. She looked frantically at Jacob, then at Robert, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. "It was family money," Andrea shrieked, dropping the crying act completely. "We raised her, we fed her. She owed us for keeping a roof over her head." Robert looked firmly at the floor. He could not look at Lauren. He could not look at me. The golden child was finally seeing the dark, rotting wood underneath the gold plating. The illusion was completely dead. Jacob Sterling closed his navy blue binder. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent library. He stood up slowly, deliberately buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Robert and Andrea with a level of disgust I had rarely seen on a human face. "My son will not be marrying into a family of thieves," Jacob stated. His voice was quiet, but it carried absolute, devastating authority. "The wedding is cancelled, and if you attempt to contact my family or Maya ever again, my legal team will personally assist Apex Ecological with the criminal embezzlement charges." Andrea let out a raw, guttural scream. She lunged across the mahogany table, her hands grasping wildly, trying to grab the binders back as if tearing the paper would erase the truth. But it was far too late. I stood up. I slung my canvas bag over my shoulder. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, watching her drown in the consequences of her own arrogance. "The soil is finally clean," I said. I turned and walked out of the heavy oak doors. The following week, Andrea attempted her final, desperate grasp for control. She hired a cheap, aggressive lawyer and sent a formal demand letter to Apex Ecological. She claimed that because I had briefly stored my initial landscaping tools in their garage 14 years ago, she and Robert were legally entitled to 20% of my corporation. It was a pathetic, laughable attempt to claw back some wealth after the Sterling family cut them off. I did not panic. I sat with Grace in my sunlit office. We did not write a lengthy, emotional legal rebuttal. We did not argue about garage space. Grace simply mailed their lawyer a single, certified copy of the severance of support document. The document explicitly stated Andrea and Robert surrendered all financial ties, investments, and responsibilities to me the day I turned 18. By their own legal hand, they had severed any claim to my future, my labour, and my assets. Andrea's lawyer dropped her as a client 3 hours after receiving our letter. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. The massive legal threat dissolved into complete, humiliating silence. Everything collapsed in one day. A month later, I sat on a wooden bench under a massive, ancient oak tree. The late afternoon sun filtered through the green canopy, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. A few yards away, Rosie was laughing, chasing a yellow butterfly through a patch of wild daisies. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried in my chest for decades was entirely gone. I realized something profound while watching her play. You do not owe your abusers your presence just because you share a bloodline. Loyalty is earned through respect, not demanded through manipulation. If you are sitting in the dark right now, wondering why you never feel like you belong at your own family's table, please listen to me. The problem is not you. You are not broken. You are not a burden. Sometimes you are simply a healthy tree planted in deeply toxic soil. You cannot fix the dirt that refuses to hold you. Pull up your roots. Walk away. The right people will help you bloom. 6 months after the cancelled wedding, Apex Ecological hosted a grand opening. We unveiled Walter's Haven, a sprawling 5-acre therapeutic sensory garden situated right in the centre of the city. We designed it specifically for children with sensory processing disorders and physical disabilities. The pathways were wide enough for wheelchairs, and the plants were carefully selected for their safe textures and calming fragrances. Hundreds of people attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The mayor was there. Jacob Sterling was there, standing proudly as the primary corporate sponsor of the project. I stood at the podium, holding Rosie's hand, looking out at the crowd of smiling faces. I did not mention Andrea or Robert. They were entirely erased from my narrative. They had become social pariahs in Greenwich, their country club memberships quietly revoked. The best revenge is never loud. The best revenge is a life beautifully, undeniably lived. As the crowd began to disperse, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the lavender bushes. It was Lauren. She looked completely different. Her designer clothes were gone. She wore simple jeans and a plain grey sweater. She walked up to me, her eyes red, her posture stripped of all the old arrogance. "I left them," Lauren said quietly, keeping her eyes focused on the soil. "I moved into a small apartment. I am trying to figure out how to live without the lies. I need a job. Maya, I do not want a handout. I just want to learn how to work." I looked at my sister, the golden child, finally standing in the real world, asking for a chance to get her hands dirty. I did not offer her an executive position. I walked over to a nearby tool shed, pulled out a pair of heavy, mud-stained gardening gloves, and handed them to her. "Report to the greenhouse tomorrow at 6 in the morning," I told her. She took the gloves, tears spilling over her eyelashes, and nodded. I watched Lauren walk away, the heavy gardening gloves clutched tightly in her hands. I knelt down next to Rosie, who was busy examining a smooth, grey river stone. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of fresh air and sunshine. I had lost a family of blood, but I had built an empire of dirt, water, and genuine love. Legacy is not what you are handed on a silver platter. Legacy is what you have the absolute courage to protect and nurture when everything else tries to tear it down. The roots I planted are finally deep, strong, and entirely my own. If this story gave you the courage to plant your own seeds and walk away from toxic soil, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next one.